Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about leg cuts. Now I often hear people say that they can't land leg cuts in sword sparring, and in my experience I find leg cuts to be one of my most reliable strikes that I land quite often. And granted, a lot of those people who say that they can't land leg cuts come from a HEMA background, and I don't do HEMA. But what I do is I do full contact sword sparring, so maybe my tips might be helpful. Let's go through how I land leg cuts. So I almost always land my leg cuts, and that's for two reasons. The first is because I only go for a leg cut when I know that I can land it, and the second, more importantly, is that I have a very specific setup for them. So let's have a look at the setup. So for the setup, I go into a right high stance, and I aim a downwards cut towards my opponent's left shoulder. And as soon as I see that they react for that, and they go to either block or counter that, then I change my cut to go for a downwards cut towards their right leg. Now, I often use this in sword sparring because a leg cut in historic times would be quite devastating. You know, if you take a good cut to the arm, you can still fight with one arm. But if you take a good cut to the leg, well, you know, what are you going to do? Are you going to hop around? It's quite devastating from a dueling perspective. So why this particular setup for the leg cut? Well, leg cuts are usually dangerous because you cross the level of mid-guard. And because of that, then the opponent in mid-guard can very easily go to block or to counter, going for a strike to the head as a very easy counter to leg cuts. Now this setup mitigates this by aiming for the top left quadrant and then striking for the bottom right quadrant in the same line of attack. Because often when people go for the bottom right quadrant, it's with a rising cut, and it's very obvious to see when you go from a downwards cut into a rising cut. But this setup allows you to strike that bottom right quadrant using a downwards cut. So in this way, then they draw their guard up to block or to counter you aiming for their left shoulder, and they've drawn the guard away from mid-guard. So you can cross that level quite easily, and faster than they can react, you can strike towards their right leg. Now people ask, well, what if they don't react to you going for their top left quadrant, for you aiming for their left shoulder? Well, if they don't react to block or to counter that, just strike their left shoulder. Don't worry about the leg cut at all, just take the hit to the left shoulder. Now people say, well, what if they go for your head as a counter? I think that this is a really good way to counter against leg cuts, but this setup mitigates that as well. Because this strike crosses over the midline, then if they go for a strike to your head, you can quite easily see it coming, and because your sword is over here, you can parry it very nicely, very easily. Now the most important thing with this setup is not to bend forward too much. You see a lot of people when they go for their leg cuts, then they bend forward and they go low to strike towards the leg. And I don't think this is how leg cuts should be done, at least not with this setup. The reason being that if you have your head downwards, then it's a very easy opportunity for them to strike at your head, and you don't have as much biomechanics to help with that parry to deflect a downwards blow coming. The other thing is also just your vision is impaired because you are facing forward looking at the ground. So taking a wide step and sinking your weight from the knees rather than from bending at the hip is really important with this setup. And that way then your head is up, your body is up, and you can react to counters to the head. So hopefully this was interesting and it lets you land more leg cuts. You got to go and practice it. Just because you know the setup, if you don't practice it, you'll never be able to land it in sparring. So, you know, if you're from a HEMA background, then I'd really love to know whether this works for you, because there's a good chance that it might not, given long sword, longer weapons, you know, just a different style of sparring. So your opponent might react in a very different way. So if it works for you, let me know down in the comments below. And if it doesn't work for you, then also let me know down in the comments below, but I'd love to know why it didn't work for you. So I hope you like this video, and with that, I'll see you next time.